Hello, Phil.
How you doing?
I couldn't be better, but beautiful day today.
Beautiful day
We're doing
today.
this on Wednesday instead of Sunday, but it's beautiful.
Can't get enough of that sunshine.
No,
Seems
no.
like. Jay, we left out from Joseph
Right.
and from the book of Genesis, and we're going to get in talking about Jesus in this series of lessons, and how the first part of it talks about his service, the humble service that he always performed.
Right.
We think of Jesus, he was always giving. He was giving advice. He was helping people who were sick. He was helping people. He was helping people. Mm-hmm. Always doing something like that. So we don't always have people doing that. We have people in foreign countries today that are homeless, walking to places away from bombs and not knowing what tomorrow's going to bring. And
Putin would be considered the opposite of being a humble person than serving people, right?
he sure would.
He's all in it for himself.
Being like Jesus, we have certain opportunities if we emulate him, and if we try to live our lives in a life of service. There are rewards not only for doing God's work and seeing it done, having that reward, but it just fills your heart when you do something like that.
Yep.
And we should treasure those opportunities of humble service. And the humility that he showed was different than we see a lot today.
Absolutely.
Well, especially if we're watching a ball game or something, the way they pound their chests, and and it doesn't matter if you're watching high school or what. It just seems like everything is kind of about themselves.
Now to get all they can for themselves, not worrying about anybody, what it does to anybody else or what they can do for anybody else.
Right. Well, being connected to Christ gives us an opportunity for a life of abundance. If we don't have bad habits, if we do the things Christ says, we're not going to suffer like we would if we were doing for the other side. And if we treasure Jesus as we should, we'll show that humble spirit. Let's look at the scriptures.
Yeah, and of course, this is, Phil, that tonight starts a series of, I think it's 7 lessons, and they're all about the last thing Jesus taught to the disciples. He's in the upper room tonight when John starts his message. It starts in John chapter 13. And you and I know and believe that Jesus knew exactly, he didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but he knew by this time tomorrow afternoon he was going to be dead. He didn't really know exactly what the process would be to get there, but he knew this was his last night. And we're going to see that he chose to serve people. Now,
What would you do if you knew it was going to be your last night? Your last night on earth, JR.
yeah, I thought about that. I don't know if I'd be too willing to serve. I might be wanting to be served myself, but I don't know. We don't know what we do. That's a good thing about not knowing when we're going to die, Phil. I think that's good. I think if we did, it would be bad for us.
Well, I think it's safe to say that if you knew you were going to pass, if you knew it, you would address the things that you were most concerned
No, that's
about.
true. That's true.
And he had some reservations, some concerns with his disciples.
Yeah, he knew he hadn't taught them everything they needed to hear.
Had he not taught them, or had they just forgotten?
They hadn't gotten the point.
It didn't sink in?
No, it didn't sink in. So he's going to try it again. So let's look at John chapter 13, verses 3 through 5. This is John writing. John says, Jesus knew that the Father had given everything into his hands, that he had come from God and that he was going back to God. So he got up from the supper. They're having the Last Supper around the table, Phil. Laid aside his outer clothing, took a towel, tied it around himself. Next he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and to dry them with the towel tied around him. John gives us some insight into Jesus in the first verse. First part of that, he says, Jesus knew that the Father had given everything into his hands. Think of all the miracles Jesus performed. Jesus was given all power in heaven and on earth while he was here. Now, we know he could have saved himself. We know that, but he didn't. He chose not to. We know he had performed every kind of miracle. So Jesus knew that he had the power from God. Then he says that he had come from God. What hint do we have early in Jesus' life that he knew where he was from?
Well, when he stunned the man in the temple, the priests
at
and
age 12.
scholars, he was just a boy.
Do you think he knew at that point in time exactly how his life was going to play out?
Not at that time.
Not at that time. I don't think he did. I think he was beginning to grow into it at that time. He knew, though, where he was from. He knew that he was the Son of God, even at 12 years old. Then it says in the last part of the verse that Jesus knew he was going back to God. But I think Jesus also knew at that point in time there, at that particular night, he knew he was going to be with God, his Father, tomorrow or whenever that was, or during that 3-day period. But he didn't know exactly how he was going to get there. But he knew it was going to be pain and suffering and sorrow. Sorrow for other people were going to be sorrowful for what had happened to him, and it was going to be painful for him to go through the process he was going through. With that in mind, what did Jesus choose to do? He chose to teach his disciples by washing their feet. Now, we don't wash feet. We don't think about washing our family's feet when they come to visit a visitor. But in that day and time, all their traveling, or most of their traveling, was on foot. And if having been in the Middle East, there's dust everywhere. Constantly, the dust is blowing, and it's dirty. It's dirty. Their feet were always dirty. The custom was that when you went to someone's house, that the lowest servant in the house washed the people's feet as they came in. They took their shoes off outside and came in. And the lowest servant would be the one that washed their feet. Now, Middle Eastern people today don't wash people's feet when they come in, but they never wear a shoe in the house. When we were over visiting our son-in-laws, and we went to their house the first time, there was probably 30 or 40 people there. You couldn't hardly get into the house for the shoes sitting outside on the porch. They don't wear shoes in the house. And I asked Ahmed why that was. He said, well, they didn't want dirt and stuff carried off their shoes, carried into their carpet, because they might be praying in a room and be kneeling down and praying all the time. They didn't want the floor to be dirty. Our grandkids, They don't wear shoes in our house. They get used to it at house. But it's the same process goes on today, but they don't wash their feet. But that's what Jesus chose to do, to wash the disciples' feet. Now, he was very methodical in his approach. It talks about him getting got up from the supper table. They were probably in two tables off to the side maybe, and they kind of laid down on couches and ate. And their feet were probably sticking out behind them. Unlike us, when we sat under a table, they didn't sit under a table. They sat out with their feet out.
And we think of a table as something this high.
Yeah.
Their tables were down low.
And he says he got up. Now, it doesn't say anything about him asking the disciples if they wanted their feet washed. It says he took off his outer garment. When in this process do you think one of the disciples thought to himself, what's going on?
What's he doing?
What's he doing? Now, I can see this happening, Phil, as the one closest to Jesus might have seen it, but the others, 8 or 10, we know they were all there, 12 of them there. At this time, Judas was even there. They probably weren't paying a lot of attention. They were busy eating. Mm-hmm. But as he began to go through the process, he got up, took his outer garment off, which was really a symbol. In his case, it was probably a symbol of a rabbi, of a teacher. He probably wore a different one than they did because he was a teacher. He tied a towel around his waist, poured some water in a bowl, and began to wash her feet. Now, he did this to a group of men, Phil, who had, on numerous occasions, had discussed what?
Who would be the greatest?
Who would be the greatest in heaven? Yeah. And we know that James and John's mother even came to Jesus and said, I want you to make sure my sons sit beside one on the right and one on the left.
One on the right and left, that's right.
So,
yeah.
Do you think he knew they needed this lesson? Yes, he did, didn't he? He knew exactly what they needed. Of course, we're going to see the next few weeks that a lot of lessons that they needed that he is going to teach them this last hours of his life. But he writer writes it like this. I think this is good. Jesus did in humility, because as I said, the lowest servant was usually the person that did this. Jesus did in humility what the lowest servant or disciple should have done. This probably should have already been done by someone there. He took the designated bowl, pitcher, and towel and got to the task. It was not unusual for a disciple to wash his master's feet. A disciple would be a follower of a rabbi, a particular rabbi. He would wash the master's feet. Mm-hmm. But as a sign of respect, a rabbi, however, who Christ was, would never wash his disciples' feet. Yeah. But Jesus washed all of his feet.
And think of the condition of the church, of the Hebrew people, the Jewish religion. Wasn't that the whole thing?
Yeah.
Their piety and their lack of humility. They were.
Nobody else was good except for them, the leaders.
Yeah.
And it says here that yet here was the greatest rabbi of all time, emptying himself and taking on the form of a servant. So we see Jesus beginning to wash the disciples' feet. So far, nobody said anything. But I'm sure by this time, if he's washed 2 or 3 of his feet, that they begin to murmur among themselves and say, what's going on here?
What are some obstacles that we have in being humble servants? We know that they had a little bit of arrogance going on there with the rabbis. What's some of them for us?
Well, is it not the same with them? They were all fussing about who's going to be the greatest. We want to feel like that we are special, better than everybody else, right?
We're special.
Even among the 12 that were following him every day, there was several of them wanted to be first in the kingdom.
We're pride.
Yep. So let's look at 6 through 10 and see what happens when he gets to old Peter.
Okay, he came to Simon Peter, who asked him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus answered him, what I'm doing you don't realize now, but afterward you will understand. Well, you will never wash my feet, Peter said. Jesus replied, if I don't wash you, you have no part with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head. One who is bathed, Jesus told him, doesn't need to wash anything except his feet. But he is completely clean. You are clean, but not all of you. So Peter, he's our favorite example for a disciple. He wasn't going to have him doing nothing like that to him, was he? No.
You're not going to wash my feet.
Why would he be that way, JR? We talked about pride.
That's what I think it was. His pride got in the way. He said, I'm not going to let you do that.
Yeah.
It was his pride bothering him.
Is it the same thing when someone wants to help us out? Let's say we suffered a tragedy or we had a barn blown over and we don't want to accept the help because we know we're able and capable of doing it ourselves, and then we don't let those people bless us.
Let me see if I can get this right, what Bill Tabb used to say. He said it's easy to help someone who needs help. If someone needs help and you and him and them have a problem or have had a problem for years, it's easy for you to help them. But when you know that you've forgiven him is when you can ask them to help you. That's when you know you're forgiven.
That's a wise man.
That's a wise man. Bill Tabb was a wise man, absolutely.
Well, they were all quiet until this happened.
Yeah. Well,
none of the disciples said anything. What do you think was going through their mind?
Well, I don't know. I think they had to be wondering what he was doing. Why is he doing this?
Peter being the brash one. You gonna wash my feet?
Peter couldn't stand it. He had to ask.
You gonna wash my feet? And tries to get him not to. And Jesus answered him, "What I'm doing you don't realize now, but you will understand afterward." Peter didn't like to wait for nothing. We remember when they were out on the water. And he wanted to walk to him, didn't he?
Yeah.
And he did until he started looking away, and then he sunk.
Yeah.
But Jesus encouraged him to be patient.
Yeah.
Which is sometimes what we have the biggest doggone problem doing is just waiting and being patient and waiting on God. We try to make everything happen ourselves. We know Peter didn't like to wait, and I know he's got a guy here that's named Phil that's a whole lot like him.
Well, even we know that Peter's character was not to be patient. But doesn't Jesus ask us to do things that are outside our normal character? Whether it's patience or something else that we don't like to do, that's what a lot of times Jesus will ask us to do.
It is. But now, in this instance, we all have to let Jesus wash our feet.
Yeah, yeah.
We all have to come to Jesus for that grace. Mm-hmm. No other way that we can be forgiven our sins other than through Jesus' blood. So, Peter, that's why Jesus told him, said, "You must let me do it. Mm-hmm. Otherwise I had no part in it. It's all or everything, all or nothing." So many times people try to make a partial commitment to Christ. It doesn't work that way. It's got to be all or nothing. We have to allow Jesus to clean our dirtiest parts, and then we should be faithful to keep it clean, to do the right thing. And when we do that, we have a satisfying relationship with Christ, and it's like nothing else. For those who have never experienced that, it's like nothing else. But we have to accept that grace, that forgiveness. Jesus' ministry being all in or not, what's Peter do? Is he all in now? He says, "Oh, my feet and my hands and my head and everything else."
Yeah.
Which was his usual reaction. He'd go overboard a little bit.
Yeah.
But in this instance, was he really all in? He says he is here.
Yeah.
He makes it.
We're going to find out in a few hours he's not all in, right?
Exactly.
We're going to find out a few hours down the road.
We know that he failed miserably a little later on that same night. But in this expression, it just takes Peter a lot longer to figure it all out. He wanted to follow Jesus. He wanted to be identified with him. And he asked Jesus to cleanse every part of him, contaminated by sin. And he really hadn't made the type of commitment that Jesus had wanted him to. The exchange here it explains everything. Jesus described the actions that any good banquet guest would take. You know, he would bathe them, he would wash and anoint them himself, and then they'd use fragrant oils on their feet or whatever, and then provide them clean clothes if their clothes were dirty, and actually wash their clothes out. So, and it was customary for them to take care of each other that way as they traveled those dusty roads with nothing but a board strapped to their feet that they called sandals.
You're right.
And dirty, dusty. It was customary and appropriate to have if you were hosting people, to have a servant ready to go or someone designated to do those things.
Yeah.
And so you would think the disciples would have at least tried to tidy up a little bit before Jesus came, but evidently didn't. But Jesus said, one who is bathed, Jesus told him, doesn't need to wash anything except his feet, but he's completely clean. It's spiritual cleanliness that he's talking about, and we know that. Clean through his blood. Our daily sins, we need to address them and ask for forgiveness as soon as we realize it. Not wait for a special prayer time or something. When that thought hits our head that we might have sinned, we need to ask God to take care of it. Let's look at the next scripture.
And we're looking at John 13, 14 through 16 now. Jesus says, so if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should also do just as I have done for you. Truly I tell you, anytime he says truly I tell you, or truly, truly, you need to listen to it. A servant is not greater than his master, and a messenger is not greater than the one who sent him. Jesus wraps up the lessons by saying, I have washed your feet, and you ought to wash one another's feet. Then he says in verse 15, you should do as I have done to you. Now, and then he tells us in 16 that we should be willing to do the things that Jesus has taught us with his actions. Are these three verses about foot washing? Because there are some churches and congregations and denominations who believe in foot washing. Are these about foot washing, or are they about something else?
Who knows? Who knows? I mean, it's certainly an example that Jesus put out there. I'm not saying it's wrong to wash people's feet.
No, I'm not either.
But it's not an ordinance, I don't think.
No.
It was his way of saying, put your fellow man before you.
He's talking about living a life of humility with your fellow men, and being humble, putting yourself in the place of a servant rather than a leader, is what he's saying.
You've talked about when your combine burnt.
Yeah.
And how the farmers around you rallied and
Yep.
came in and took in your crops.
Yep.
You never forget it.
No, I can tell you who most of them were. That was in 1978, maybe, somewhere along in there. Maybe a little earlier than
I
that.
don't know, I remember it. But
74 or 5.
I don't remember when it was.
Yeah, early mid-70s.
But and I remember the men doing that.
Yeah.
And we've heard of numerous things like that since in our community. And people on an individual basis, that are going through a hard time. When you've been blessed by someone's humble service like that, it stands out, doesn't it?
And
It sticks with you for years.
I think you look for opportunities. You should look for opportunities to do the same thing back to someone in that situation. The writer says here that Jesus taught his disciples to be humble to the extent he was humble. Then he goes on to say, this was a dramatic, vivid demonstration of true humble service. There was no academic instruction. He didn't tell them how to do it. He gave a strong command to do just as I have done for you. The disciples, and we are to serve humbly in the same manner and extent he served them at that meal.
Actions over words.
Actions over words. Yeah. Now, he went, but that wasn't the end of his service, this lesson. Because in verse 17, he tells us, now that you know these things, and they're not in your book there, but now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. God's telling us, going on to say more there, that since we know to be humble, since he's shown us how to be humble, that if we do what he says and act the way he's acted, then he will bless us throughout our Christian life. Now, the disciples are going to realize that this was not Jesus' greatest act of service in a few short hours. This is probably 8 or 9 o'clock on Friday night, on Thursday night. And Friday morning at noontime, he's going to be hung on a cross.
Yeah.
And that's his greatest act of service. He did that, sacrificed himself, allowed himself to be sacrificed so that our sins can be forgiven, and we can, and also we can spend eternity with him and all the saints. Feel he will bless us as we humble ourselves and before others, just as he humbled himself before the disciples on that Friday night before he was
Like you
betrayed.
said, we ought to look for those opportunities to do those types of things. They make a difference in a person's life. If you take a person that has never experienced that thing, the humility of Christ in action, it sure makes an impact on them, doesn't it? I know I've seen people that had no religious affiliation at all, and they just humbled into submission by God's Spirit working through other people. It's a grand thing.
What is it, and how do you feel when you do humble yourself and take that opportunity that God gives you, Christ gives you, to show your humility and to show the service that he did here? How does it make you feel?
Well, it's not why you do it, but there's nothing that's like it.
No.
It's the best feeling you can have to know that you've impacted somebody's life in a positive way like that. Helped them when they're really down, or offered them a word of advice or something that, maybe the Lord has walked you through a bad time, and you're able to share that with somebody and help them out. There's nothing like it, Joe.
Yeah.
It's why we're here.
I like that first one there under Live It Out. It says start small.
Start small.
Some of those things there, Phil, we don't like to do that. Do we like to let people into traffic? No.
We have different guides that we study these lessons in. My first one says make a list.
Make a list?
Yeah, make a list. Consider
Okay.
the ways that Jesus has served you,
Okay.
and thank him for those things in your time with him this week. Just think of all the many ways that he has sent people to you, that he's helped walk you through those hard times. And then pray for somebody you can serve. Pray for us to have open eyes and ears. Be ready to serve in a moment's notice. It's a good start.
Yep,
Good
sure
start
is.
with these lessons. Unlike the kings in the medieval days, or some of the leaders that we see in the world today, we choose to humble ourselves and serve others. We'll be exalted. That's not why we do it.
Right.
But we will be exalted. And most of all, Jesus Christ will be exalted. Good lesson.
Yep.
Thank you all for joining us. Hope you can be back with us next week. See you.